The gender-critical feminists that I mentioned earlier are critical of trans ideology, but they don't understand how their own movement created it. No, trans ideology came about directly on the high heels of feminism. You made this. You did it.
Hi everyone. Some of the comments I get about feminism and feminists are ridiculous, and I'd already decided it was high time I addressed them, and I was busy making notes for a video when my attention was drawn to a rant by Matt Walsh in response to Helen Joyce. You've just seen a tiny bit of it, and what Matt said happened to be the main claim I wanted to focus on anyway, because it is a claim that comes up time and again beneath my videos and all over the web, which is that feminists are to blame for the phenomenon of transgenderism. I'll show you what Helen Joyce had said, as well as plenty more from Matt during the course of this video. But before we go there, let me just state at the outset, for those who don't realise it, that feminism is by definition for female human beings. A call for equality between people of all genders isn't feminism, it is postmodernist drivel. Feminism is not for those men who think they are some kind of woman or wish they were. The point of feminism is to make things better for women and girls. I'm trying to put it as simply as possible. And there has never been unity amongst feminists or on just about anything, on what exactly would make things better and why and how to achieve it, and on the nature of men and of women and how we are similar and how we are different. I mean, if we go back to the campaign for women's suffrage, there were those who argued that women needed political representation, as women are different from men and have very specific needs that were not being addressed by male politicians and the laws they were making. And there were those who argued that women should have political representation because actually women are not that different from men, and they were just as capable as men of contributing to the greater good of society, and indeed, as waged workers and taxpayers, they should have a say in who represented them. And those differences of opinion amongst feminists, both of which are perfectly legitimate points of view while we're all working things out, they have been apparent in feminist discourse ever since, right up to the present day. So to assume that any one feminist speaks for all feminists is wrong. And to talk about feminism as monolithic is also wrong. And another thing that's wrong is assuming that it's not just feminists, but radical feminists that are the ones primarily responsible for transgenderism. Here is a comment on one of my videos. I do hold the belief that it is all women's fault. Yeah, of course you do. You're a man. Women, specifically radical feminist women, determined that trans women are the same as what humanity considered a woman, and they pushed the rest of society to accept that belief and codify it into laws, especially where it affects women-only spaces. No, they didn't. I don't know what country this bloke is talking about, but that hasn't happened here in the UK. But the main point I want to make here is that there is a widespread misunderstanding of what radical feminism is. In fact, those who define themselves as radical feminists, and I'm not one of them, by the way, but those who call themselves radfems are more likely to see transgenderism as the consequence of the pernicious ideology rooted in misogyny and homophobia that it is, and to oppose it. It is primarily a liberal feminist rather than a radfem position to give any credence at all to gender lunacy. What I would say is that any actions, any campaigns, any struggles whose specific purpose is to make things better for women and girls are feminist campaigns, regardless of whether those engaged in that campaigning work call themselves feminists or whatever they call themselves. I would also say that any campaign or any idea that is put into practice whose foreseeable consequences to make things worse for women and girls is an anti-feminist campaign, regardless of whether those engaged in that campaign call themselves feminists or not, and regardless of whether they have contributed to genuine feminist campaigns or not. An example of an idea whose consequence is to make things worse for women and girls is obviously the idea that a man can be a woman, and that if a man declares himself to be a woman, then he should be accepted as one and be able to access women's sex-based rights and protections. And this is what Matt Walsh and many others are blaming feminists for.
The feminists are the ones who first argued that men and women are basically the same, aside from meaningless anatomical differences. They are the ones who declared that most sex differences are social constructs. Sound familiar?
I don't think Matt has ever read any feminist theory. It is a pretty fundamental feminist argument that it is women's ability to bear children that explains why historically men have wanted to own and control women, and why laws and customs and practices that keep women subjugated developed in just about every culture. This is what we mean by patriarchal societies, and it's probably why the likes of Matt Walsh apparently can't bear to let those practices go. Here's a similar comment on one of my videos. I remember once upon a time feminists saying that men and women were interchangeable at root, that all disparities between men and women were due to sexism. And he goes on to argue that all the trans lobbyists have done is say that given that men and women are interchangeable at root, men can interchange to being women and vice versa. As if entitled or fetishistic men have ever seriously listened to feminists. No, you don't remember anyone saying that men and women are interchangeable at root, because no feminist has ever said that. This is a misrepresentation of the argument that differences in personal qualities and behaviours between men and women are primarily the result of socialization as opposed to biology. Obviously, we know a lot more about hormones now. We know a lot about the role of testosterone in certain male typical behaviors, and these discoveries undermine the argument that it's all down to socialization. The debate about male and female brains is far from settled. Nevertheless, the socialization argument does have some merit, as we have seen over the past century. Allowing girls to get more and better educated and giving women more opportunities, they are now fulfilling roles that they were once believed to be incapable of doing. That is the true meaning of biological essentialism, that our personal traits and capabilities are determined by sex, and the ones associated with men are called masculine and the ones associated with women are called feminine. This is one of many such tables of qualities that I found on the web. Masculine traits include being aggressive, independent, tough, logical, and feminine includes passive, talkative, emotional, kind. I mean, some of those are obviously nonsense. I don't personally subscribe to the tabula rasa, the notion that we are all blank slates conditioned to be masculine or feminine. It's far more complicated than that. But in many roles, we have seen that men and women are interchangeable. There is no point in denying this, however much you might not like it. And the obvious conclusion of this guy's argument is that women shouldn't have done all that. They shouldn't have got educated. They shouldn't have gone out and become leaders in industry and politics or anywhere else. They shouldn't have become scientists and engineers or carpenters or plumbers or whatever. They should have just shut up and stayed at home. But since they didn't do that, they weren't content to do that. Of course, men are going to pretend to be women. Serves us right. In fact, no feminist has ever denied physiological differences between men and women, which is what the words at root imply. If the anatomical differences Matt refers to are differences in average size and strength, then don't try to pretend that those differences matter that much in most roles and occupations nowadays. Useful in opening jars, though. Here's another comment. I think this transgender nonsense can be traced back to the radical feminists of the 1970s who argued that gender was just a social construct and that men and women are basically the same. By denying all innate differences between men and women and teaching that all human behaviour was learned and not innate, that women could be good soldiers and men could be good mothers, the feminists opened the door to this idiocy. This is an extraordinary comment in which, so far as I'm concerned, the poster shoots himself in the foot. I doubt he was ever a good soldier. He's suggesting that women can't be good soldiers when there is a massive amount of evidence to the contrary in many different armies around the world. These Syrian Kurdish women fought back against ISIS and played a crucial role in defeating them. You're trying to deny that? Shame on you. He's also denying men can make good mothers. Obviously, men can't be any kind of mother because they are men, and mother is a word reserved for women. Granted, mothering a child has a different meaning from fathering a child. So presumably what he means is that men aren't good at being the parent with primary responsibility for loving and nurturing their child, or can't change nappies or patch up a hurty knee or something. Why would he think that? Does he not know any loving hands-on fathers? Because I do, and in fact I was lucky enough to have a couple of kids with one of them. Now on to gender, and another comment starting with this question. Tell me, Maria, who was it that created the distinction between sex and gender and insisted on pure blank slatism in the first place? Tell you what, I'll let Matt Walsh answer that. Here's what he said in a speech last year, 2022.
The roots of modern gender ideology can be traced all the way back to the 19th century, in fact, arguably even earlier than that. But it really began to take its current shape in the mid-20th century thanks to the work of two hideously evil crackpots named Alfred Kinsey and John Money.
What? Not feminists, then?
As for John Money, he was a prominent psychologist and sexologist and one of the early pioneers of the gender theories that are currently taught in grade schools and universities. He was among the first to take the word gender out of the realm of grammar and apply it to people. Because until him, we never said that people have a gender. Well, people have a sex, and gender is, words have gender. But he said, no, people have gender and sex. And he coined that. He also coined the terms gender role, gender identity, and sexual orientation.
On that occasion, Matt was right, or largely right. The meaning of the word gender in English has evolved. I have described in at least one, possibly two previous videos, the philosopher Kathleen Stock's observations of 4 different ways in which the word is now used over and above its use in categorizing nouns in certain foreign languages. In the mid-20th century, the word was adopted by psychologists and psychiatrists to refer to the behavioral characteristics traditionally associated with people of one sex or the other. And this sexologist called John Money is the man most widely credited with starting it all, with a paper he wrote in 1955 in which he used the term gender role. That is the first reported usage of the word gender in any modern sense, and he defined it as, quote, all those things that a person says or does to disclose himself or herself as having the status of boy or man, girl or woman, respectively. And it's interesting to note that he included sexual orientation in that definition. Probably the most famous or notorious example of an experiment of blank slatism, the idea that everything is down to social conditioning, is the David Reimer case. I'm sure many of you know this story, but for those who don't, the boy who is now referred to as David Reimer was born in Canada in 1965, and as a result of a catastrophic accident during circumcision as a baby, he lost his penis, and a few years later he became the guinea pig of Dr. John Money, who told his parents that they could raise him as a girl alongside his identical twin brother, and he'd never know any better. It was disastrous, and David ended up committing suicide. So did his brother. What Matt gets wrong is that he repeats quite a common misattribution of the term gender identity to John Money, but that, in fact, was coined by psychiatrists Robert Stoller and Ralph Greenson in the same sort of era. None of these men, Kinsey, Money, Stoller, or Greenson, were feminist allies. They shared the conservative view held by Matt Walsh and by the commenters on my videos that certain qualities are either masculine or feminine, and it is this regressive notion on which transgender ideology is based. What feminists did and continue to do is challenge the very idea that some qualities are strictly masculine and others feminine. What feminists have always done is the exact opposite of the charge being made against them. What some second-wave feminist theories can be criticized for, perhaps, is adopting the word gender and applying it to what they had previously referred to as sex roles. When I was growing up in the 1960s and towards the end of that decade becoming attuned to the women's movement, I never heard the word gender outside of its use in foreign grammar. I heard about women's roles, women's lot, and about how these were being challenged in a way that made a lot of sense to my very young ears. But feminist theorists started to use the word gender to refer to social systems whose purpose was to keep women subjugated, meaning what women were required to do, what they were raised to do, and very often what they were forced to do to fulfill cultural expectations of them. And it was to challenge those expectations that the women's liberation movement arose, and thankfully has been quite successful at challenging a lot of these backward notions. I say thankfully on behalf of the women who have been able to achieve more in life than the likes of Matt Walsh would have us do, obviously. Another comment from my channel. 50 years of feminists undermining sex roles will be hard to reverse. No, it won't be hard to reverse, it will be impossible to reverse because women have shown what we are capable of, and we have won legislative reforms to stop people like you from discriminating against us on the grounds of our sex. So much as you and the other commenters and Matt Walsh might like to see us return to being barefoot, pregnant and chained to the kitchen sink, it ain't happening. Remember, it was feminism, gender, social construct over biological nature that has created this mess. Trans is its logical conclusion. Right, so you think that women challenging your regressive ideas about what is feminine and proving ourselves as capable as men in many different fields would inevitably lead to men claiming to be women? Because, if what you see as masculine is innate in men, if it's inherent to being a man, if it's part of their biological nature, why would any man want to be perceived as feminine? Why would any man want to be a woman? It doesn't sound very logical to me. Could you perhaps contemplate the possibility that those qualities we call masculine and those we call feminine are largely socially constructed in the sense that we attribute the masculine ones to men and the feminine ones to women, and that's why girls who like climbing trees are called tomboys, and that there are men who feel more comfortable with tastes and behaviours generally perceived as feminine and the other way round. And there's nothing wrong with that. If we allowed people a bit more freedom of self-expression, why would anyone feel the need to LARP as the other sex? And I think the answer to that lies at least partly in autogynephilia, and you can't blame feminists for men's fetishes. There is no logical follow-through from the premise of women rebelling against their prescribed subordinate role and wanting to use their individual skills and talents in the workplace and play a full part in decision-making, and men wanting to cross-dress and access women's spaces and sports. They are totally separate issues. Okay, I think it's time we looked at what inspired Matt's cathartic rant. Here is the clip he shows of Helen Joyce in conversation with Michael Shermer.
You know who Matt Walsh is. He's a very conservative Catholic. He's somebody who's anti-abortion, he says feminism is the worst thing that's ever happened to Western civilization, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think he understands, in fact, I'm certain he doesn't understand, that makes him part of the whole problem. Because the problem is that both conservatives like Matt Walsh and gender ideologues that he's mocking, completely fairly, both believe that gender stereotypes and gender roles are inherent to what it is to be a woman. One side uses them to define what a woman is. Matt Walsh thinks that they're inseparable. He understands that a man is a male person and a woman is a female person, but he thinks a whole load of things follow from that, about who's in charge, who makes the sandwiches, whose voice gets heard, and all of this sort of thing.
Are we clear so far? These are the rigid sex roles that Matt and the commenters I've shown approve of. Conservatives like them choose to believe that they arise naturally from men and women's innate qualities. The logical conclusion then is that if you are one of those unnatural men who'd rather be making the sandwiches than being in charge, you might want to take the opportunity to escape from manhood if it is presented to you. And the other way round for the women who don't want to make the sandwiches and who do want to be in charge. It was not feminists, by the way, who experimented with what were once upon a time called sex change surgeries or who introduced cross-sex hormones. It was male doctors following the rigid and conservative belief that there is only one way to be a man and only one way to be a woman, and anyone who didn't naturally feel that way, the way they were supposed to as a man or a woman, there was something wrong with them, born in the wrong body, perhaps.
Well, if you give your average teenage girl the choice between cutting off her breasts, taking testosterone, and having a shot at being seen as the half of humanity that's regarded as truly human, or accepting that she's Matt Walsh's wife in the kitchen making sandwiches and asking him to open the jar, which is very near the end of the film, she'll cut her tits off and take testosterone.
Oh my God.
So he's part of the problem.
That's pretty harsh and facetious, I guess, but not completely off the wall. As a result of the widespread dissemination of gender ideology, girls now have the opportunity to escape, as they see it, the horrors of womanhood, and unscrupulous surgeons have the chance to make a fast buck. So everyone's happy until they're not anymore.
That's interesting, Helen. You're saying that rigid gender roles, as you would describe them, give rise to trans ideology.
She didn't say that. She said the problem that you are part of is the belief that gender stereotypes and gender roles are inherent to what it is to be a woman or a man, and this is a belief shared by conservatives like you and by gender ideologues. It leads men who are attracted to the feminine stereotype and role to think they would have been happier as a woman in a society whose norms are strictly gendered. Where conservatives and the trans lobby diverge is that the trans lobbyists think that it should be possible and permissible for people to change sex, or at least LARP as the other sex, without anyone having the temerity to object. But that fundamental belief in gender stereotypes and roles is challenged by feminists who are actually pretty relaxed with femininity in men and masculinity in women and think there's nothing wrong with it. This should be kind of obvious given how many feminists spurn traditional notions of femininity in their own lives and appearance, but who don't claim to be men.
Did you watch the section of the film where I go to the Maasai tribe in Kenya? They have extremely well-defined and rigid gender roles and have for literally thousands of years, and they've never even heard of transgenderism.
He's being disingenuous here. Of course, the Maasai people haven't heard of the Western culture-bound phenomenon that is transgenderism. But thanks to those well-defined and rigid roles, Maasai girls have their genitals mutilated at puberty and soon afterwards are married off to a man of their father's choosing. Do you seriously think that if in their society transgenderism had become normalized as it has here, that not a single one of those abused young women, if they were offered the opportunity to escape that fate by becoming a man, even if that involved cutting off their breasts and growing beards, do you not think that at least some of them wouldn't take it? And once more, for those at the back, it was not feminists who pioneered these particular medical practices.
In fact, my, quote, traditional view of sex was the dominant view across the entire world, everywhere, in all places, everywhere on the planet, since the dawn of human civilization up until just this past century. And yet for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, traditional gender roles never led to any woman cutting her breasts off in an attempt to identify as a man.
Yeah, you know, women don't generally cut off their own breasts, right? What is happening nowadays is that young women are seeking this treatment from professional surgeons who can do it safely and offer it as part of so-called gender affirmation, which has become available as a result of both modern surgical techniques and the normalization of the idea that women can become men and vice versa. In the old days, some women who were restricted from doing what they wanted to by those same rigid gender roles you're so enamored with, still disguised themselves as men to go to war, to go to sea, to become doctors, to do all manner of things they weren't allowed to do because of their sex. And they succeeded. You think at least some of those women wouldn't have done more to look like men if the opportunity had been available, if they had believed there was an above average chance of surviving those irreversible surgeries. Of course they would. The fact that so many are doing so now should alert you to the fact that your insistence that women be like this and stick to what you think is right and proper and men be like that and do likewise is harmful bollocks.
For many decades, if anybody argued that women can compete with men in sports and do everything men can do, it would have been a feminist.
It would have been a feminist, would it? Except it wasn't, though, was it? This is really scraping the barrel now, suggesting that feminists have argued things that they never did in order to divert attention from how wrong you are about women's proven capabilities. Women fought tooth and nail on both sides of the Atlantic to be allowed to participate in sports, to compete against each other, to have their own events. And they were pushed back at every step of the way by men like Matt Walsh, who didn't approve. The only people who seriously argue that men be allowed to join women's sporting events are the trans lobby and their supporters, not feminists.
Now that argument primarily comes from trans activists, and you want to pretend that they aren't saying exactly what your club has been saying for like a century? It's absurd.
What's absurd is that Matt Walsh can get away with this level of dishonesty.
Helen, you say that I understand that a man is a male person and a woman is a female person, but that I think, quote, a whole bunch of other things follow from that. Yes, you're exactly right. I think that being a man means something, and it means more than just anatomy.
Okay, so what does it mean? What is the something that being a man means?
And being a woman means something, and it means more than just anatomy.
Yeah. At no point during this rant do we hear Matt Walsh laying out his philosophy of the meaning of being a man or a woman for us to scrutinise. What are the qualities that are or should be peculiar to men or peculiar to women? And what absolutely beggars belief is that he should tell the highly accomplished Dr. Helen Joyce this.
See, what you don't understand is that your rejection of this principle, your claim that a whole bunch of things don't follow from being a man or a woman, that being a man or a woman has essentially no significance aside from differences in sex organs, means that you and your ideology are to blame for exactly the thing you pretend to be fighting against. You made this. You did it.
Get out of here. If Matt Walsh really believes what he's saying here, then he's stupid. I don't really think he's stupid. I mean, he's obviously not as intelligent as Helen Joyce. I just think he's very invested in the conservative and religious position he has become famous for. That's the side on which his bread is buttered. And he's going to stay loyal to it, even at the cost of looking a bit silly and losing some of the respect he gained for making that documentary. As Upton Sinclair famously said, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. As far as I'm concerned, Matt Walsh and all the others who push this line are just men doing what they've done since time immemorial and blaming women for what men do. Anyway, that's enough from me. I dare I'll make another video to address some of the even nuttier comments I receive about feminists sometime. Thanks for watching. Bye.